Yesterday, Victoria and I were talking about her realization from watching people dance. Something about what she wanted in life. Something she wanted from outside our dominant culture.
When we were at that blues festival on Walter Reed up in Arlington on Saturday, I was sitting there on the curb and you were taking your photos and stuff. And I was listening to the music, and it was really a great band. And I was just shocked at how there were a few people up dancing, but in a crowd of what, 200 or 300 people, there were like maybe 10 people dancing. Sometimes you do need to sit and watch. I do see the importance of just being a spectator sometimes to figure out if that's what you really want to do, or if that's what you really like. But I realize I don't want to be just a spectator in this life. And sometimes it's really, I think this is really an American thing, the spectator thing. Because I think if you go to other countries, or even if you see other cultures, like I was sharing when our school a couple months ago had had cultural night, all of a sudden this group of women, I think it was from Ethiopia. I think that's who they were from. I think it was the Ethiopian crowd. And they all started dancing. And it was gorgeous dancing. And it was just so interactive and beautiful. And just the kids, the adults, it was, having a lovely time. And it was very gorgeous. And I thought, I just lost my mom probably a couple of weeks before that. So I was just like, oh, I want to be a part of that kind of a community.
When you see something beautiful in a culture you're not part of, how can you respond? You can be a spectator, a tourist, or if you see something in it you love, you can become part of that culture. It would probably cost you a lot. About 17 years ago near Arlington, 3 new college grads gave up a future in the American dream because they saw something beautiful in an underprivileged Latino neighborhood. So they moved in. They rented an apartment in a rundown building so they could live with and learn from Latino immigrants. The result was Casa Chirilagua, an expression of the Arlandria community coming together for service and self-advocacy. The result was public spaces. I'm Bryce Tolpin.
There's our car right in front of the auto zone.
Are you going to take pictures?
Uh-huh.
I'll go over to the, I'll get,
Yeah, I'll
give
take
this
that.
back.
Okay.
I'm going to the Dollar Tree since you're taking pictures. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
We're in Arlandria. The first immigrants in Arlandria from El Salvador in the 1980s lent Arlandria the name of a beloved Salvadorian town, Chirilagua, and the name stuck. I'm taking pictures for this episode. It's a fine late spring Saturday afternoon. People are just hanging out along Mount Vernon Avenue in the recessed storefronts and around the street food. The roasting nuts, the pupusas, the plantains, the mangoes bathed with tahine. I think of Americans spending thousands of dollars to get a curated version of this overseas. Chirilagua may be a bit too real to be a tourist attraction. The street life sort of puts a demand on you. Will you slow down like the neighbors? Will you ask the vendors what's in the tahine? Every time Victoria and I visit Chirilagua, it's a pilgrimage. It's a personal pilgrimage because we lived in a basement Airbnb a quick walk from here when we first moved to Arlington. But it's also a pilgrimage to where Danielle, Emily, and Julia moved in. What would make them do that? Why start what's called an intentional community? I recently spoke with Matt Pritchard, a Mennonite minister who has helped several intentional communities begin, including the one in Chirilagua. He spoke of his own journey from a spectator form of Christianity to a more neighborly one. He picks up with his study of America's civil rights movement in college.
Part of the studying of the civil rights movement in the U.S. was Quanania Farm and other intentional communities that sought to live out the kingdom of God in community. And so learning about folks, what they did a lot of work to have integrated communities like pre-civil rights movement and during the civil rights movement. And so learned about intentional community. And then after graduating, I was a part of a church community. I was attending worship gatherings. I was leading small group. I was leading our missions team. And I found myself becoming less and less like Jesus. So I was doing everything the church had to offer, and it wasn't resulting in me becoming more the person that I was created to be. And so I said, wait a second, what's happening? And I thought back to college, one where I was connected with people day in and day out, where we had meals together, where we interacted with one another. It's really easy to fake life for a couple of hours or even a handful of hours every week. But when we are involved in one another's lives day to day, engaging and challenging one another to truly love our neighbors as God has loved us, it's in that sort of environment and culture that enables us to actually do that. So I said, hey, I heard about this community thing. I had a taste of this in college. There's a group of us going to Brazil. We really connect well. What if we all moved in together? And so we bought a house, or not bought, we rented a house on Sleepy Hollow Road, a giant house, and we started doing community together. I began helping connect folks and finding folks who are interested in intentional community, and started forming a network of intentional Christian communities in the DC area.
Matt Pritchard has been someone whom I've associated with like intentional communities.
Yeah.
Was this did it get started that way as some form of an intentional community?
It did. So,
I'm speaking with Kate Denson, Casa Chirilagua's Director of Volunteer Engagement. It's a windy summer afternoon, and we're on Mount Vernon Avenue, just outside of the building Casa leases from the city of Alexandria. In 2007, right out of college, Kate and some friends, including Matt, moved into 3 different struggling communities.
Well, so there were 3 different groups that started. So there was like Matt's group,
Yeah.
There was the Chirilagua group, and then there was the Anacostia group. Together, we started calling ourselves a community of communities.
Although Kate moved into a DC neighborhood, she kept up with her 3 friends who moved into Chirilagua. Danielle, Emily, and Julia's large apartment complex in the heart of Chirilagua didn't give residents much for their money.
Tends to house like largely a lot of undocumented families, pretty poorly taken care of situation. So it was a hard place to live. They consistently got bed bugs every month or so, would have rats. So they were staying there and just slowly got to know people from that. And so, that's really how the whole thing started, was just a desire to come in and to be neighbors. There was never...
Instead of having this idea that we as the church come and bring God to a godless place, which is silly, frankly. We go and we observe God at work in our community, or lots of observing and lots of listening. Where is God already here? And how do I join that, rather than thinking I'm God who brings God here? So we know that immigrants experience injustice, but to more fully know that, we need to dwell among. Part of this is kind of that incarnational idea. And so they rented an apartment together, Emily, Danielle, and Julia, and they started getting to know their neighbors and talking with them and learning from them and hearing their stories. And then in response to that, over time, they started seeking to meet needs and to love their neighbors well. And that was kind of the seed that started Casa. And so they fought roaches in their apartment building. Cost of the apartments were really high. People were getting taken advantage of. They said, hey, what's just and good here, and how do we contribute to making the lives of these folks who are now part of our lives better?
Casa has grown a lot since 2007. As it did, it became a nonprofit for accountability purposes. It has a vibrant after-school program that includes mentorships, volunteers working with the same children for years to create lasting, positive relationships with immigrant families. I spoke with Adriana Gomez Schalhaus, at that time Casa's executive director, about how Casa still fits into the neighborhood. She and her family moved into the neighborhood too, but much later, during COVID.
Yeah, so I live here actually. I'm a less than a minute walk from our front door. So my family and I, we rent a townhouse down the street. Actually, a townhouse where Matt Pritchard used to live.
Oh, really?
Fun fact, yes.
Oh my gosh.
And our founders used to live there as well. Yeah. So there's a lot of history with that townhouse with Casa Chirilagua. And so we rent this townhouse now. We have 2 kids. They're 4.5. They're twins. And so we moved there in 2020. It was a very interesting time to move.
I guess you could say that the move into the neighborhood was strategic, but Adriana would say that it was mostly for her to keep herself centered.
I can illustrate this in just like even today, my experience today. So I, picked up my kids from preschool, dropped them off at home to come back to work. And as I'm walking, I've gotten to know a lot of my neighbors, particularly those who live in these like more affordable housing units. It's called like a cooperativa. They're kind of apartments that are at like a much lower rate. So I've gotten to know many of my neighbors there. Some who have children in our programs, and others who don't, who just have been living in the neighborhood. So as I'm walking, I greet them, all the time. That's what I love about living in Chirilagua, is that I feel like at home. I feel that people know me and I know them, and we greet one another. But these greets turn into conversations many times. And in the span of 20 minutes from, it's a minute walk, but like it took me 20 minutes to walk home, a walk to work, was me having conversations with my neighbors of like what's been happening in the community. And so I feel like I get a better understanding of what my community is going through, the things that, yes, we're doing such wonderful work at Casa Chirilagua, and we have relationships with families that we get to hear really hard things and really beautiful things, but also to hear them from my neighbors as well, of like, like, Adriana, this is happening. Like, one of our neighbors had a heart attack and we did like this fundraiser for them, and we raised like over $1,000 because we love one another. We are neighborly with one another. And just like having those conversations for me is such a gift, and it grounds me in the work that we do here at Casa Chirilagua, but also it grounds my faith, right? It grounds me in the way that, God commands us to love him and also love one another as ourselves, right? Love your neighbor. And so I get to experience that in a very unique way because we live in the neighborhood, right?
Moving into Chirilagua during COVID was an eye-opener. Casa Chirilagua grew a lot during COVID because it became a conduit for outside resources. But something more important in Casa was also growing: mutual aid. Chirilagua, the community, discovered its own resources.
It changed all of us, right? Everyone has been touched by what happened in 2020, right? And Casa Chirilagua was in a position where we responded during the pandemic with emergency relief. Usually emergency relief was done historically on a case-by-case basis. As we develop relationships, we hear of like maybe a family's going through, they'll share with us like this is happening with our family, and then we get to find resources to support this family, right? More on a case-by-case. Pandemic like blew that up in regards to, we were like distributing thousands of pounds of food every week. And because we had this space, because we had access to the plaza, there would be like over 700 people every Friday, like in line to get food. So that brought like a spotlight on Casa Chirilagua in a way that like people like, oh, like, go over there. That's where they give food. Or go over there. That's where. And so word started spreading. The most important thing that I want to mention is that without our neighbors and community, we wouldn't have been able to distribute, like just us staff couldn't distribute that much food. Like it would have been impossible. The community brought their ingenuity, their creativity, the resources. I like to consider Chirilagua as a neighborhood that's richly resourced. A lot of people, under-resourced communities, under-resourced. Actually, there's a lot of resources in Chirilagua. They're maybe not the resources that are more, resources that people would deem more worthy than others, like college education or like being able to, but there are tremendous resources, and we got to see them come to life during the pandemic, like the ingenuity, the creativity, the resilience, the generosity. Oh my gosh, like there were families who are going through such tough times, and they would just get their food and they're like, I'm going to share this with my neighbor because I know they can't come because they're, they have COVID or they're really sick. Just the sheer generosity that I got to experience. I think for where we are now is, how do we help individuals understand that we're not like a resource place, like we're not just here about like food distributions or anything. We connect people to resources and organizations that do that, which is wonderful, and they do such great work. But our mission is very unique in that we want to unearth the gems and the resources that exist here in Chirilagua towards community transformation.
Casa holds a mirror to the residents of Chirilagua, showing them their own creativity, resilience, and generosity. Casa the resource takes a backseat to Casa the community mirror. The local churches Casa partners with are learning the same lesson. Cutting checks is great, it supports Casa the resource, but partnering with neighbors and privileging proximity and presence over benefaction gets back to what started Casa in the first place.
Building a bridge for churches to really understand the importance of communities like Chirilagua, why proximity and presence is important, where yes, we value people's financial donations, like it's so powerful. But when you have a supporter who then becomes a mentor and who begins to build a relationship with a family in Chirilagua, where you have, in many ways, two families that are very different in socioeconomic backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, and to really form a friendship, like that's like the picture of the gospel. Like that's a picture of shalom, right? Of peace.
Matt also speaks about what Adriana calls proximity and presence.
The beauty of proximity is that it allows us to engage organically with one another. And so I think often kind of American individualism says you have to have the strength and the courage and everything you need in order to live a faithful life individually as an island. And I think the lessons of the scriptures, the lessons of the history of the church and practice of Judaism before that is that it actually takes a community.
If I write a check for the poor, American individualism still supports me. But Kate and the women who started Casa Chirilagua became poor, and they found a community that creates public space to survive. It changed their lives.
I think there's often such a push to maximizes personal opportunity, convenience, money, like those sorts of choices, and to instead to think about like love of neighbor, like choosing to move to the margins. Like this is like a different calculation, and it's upsetting. It was upsetting for many of our families. And like many of our communities to like watch us make these choices. While I think at the same time, you hold that also knowing like the place I came from, I had the power of choice. And most people in the world don't have the power of choice, So it's just a realization of like the levels of privilege that we walked through the world with that allowed us even the opportunity to make that choice. And I think we would even take that further and like put a theological statement on it of saying like, while there's privilege in a certain space. There's also like a lot of spiritual poverty. A real critique of this like white evangelicalism had left us spiritually poor. Like there were massive pieces missing from like the Bible and like vibrancy of seeing God like at work in the real world and just all these things. And so if it's like, while there's a way where maybe you could say, oh, we came because there was a need or we thought we could help, like maybe we really just came because we really needed to meet God, like, hey!
What I mean, wanna see, what I see, what I feel, wanna dream, wanna be, I'm a freak, what up? Oh, what up? Hey!
Thank you for listening to Public Spaces. On our next episode, you'll hear sculptor Zach Landsberg speak to my students about his Reclining Liberty, a popular remix of the Statue of Liberty that invites people to climb all over it, suggesting perhaps an accessible form of public liberty. Until then.